Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Freud and the psychodynamic perspective of psychology and how Freud would explain behavior. So let's go ahead and get started. Our final theory of personality is the psychodynamic perspective. We're going to start today by talking about Freud, and then in our final video we'll talk about Freud's followers, the Neo-Freudians. But the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective focused on the unconscious influences on our behavior, our thought process, and how that makes us who we are. So if you remember from our psychological perspectives, Freud believes that our behavior comes from our unconscious and unresolved childhood conflicts. Early childhood experiences have a huge impact on who we are. And so if most of this is in our unconscious, how do we know what's motivating us? Freud believed in using a concept known as free association in order to get into our unconscious. If you think about therapy and you think of the couch, where someone lies on a couch and speaks up into the air, that was a therapy process that was created by Freud. And what he believed was that when we are lying on a couch, talking up into the air, instead of looking at someone face to face, we were more likely to say whatever comes to our mind. And when we say whatever comes to our mind, we are more likely to have parts of our unconscious slip out in what's known as Freudian slips that give us insight into what's really going on beneath the surface. So free association was a huge technique that Freud used in order to understand what was going on underneath that could possibly be motivating our behavior. And so that's how Freud described our personality. You can sort of think of it like an iceberg, that most of it is unconscious, most of it is underneath and unseen and unrecognized by us. There is some of it that is in our pre-consciousness and our consciousness that is out of the water, that we can visibly see and understand. But most of it is underneath. And it's through free association, through dream analysis, and through these Freudian slips or slips of the tongue that we can find out what's really going on underneath the surface. So using this iceberg personality, we can see how Freud described the three parts of our personality. He said we have an id, an ego, and a superego. The first part of our personality to form was the id, and that was what was present at birth. The id, I like to think of it as ID, stands for I do what I want. It is the pleasure principle. It's the part of our personality that seeks to satisfy our basic drives and our wants. So think of the id as sort of like the devil on one shoulder telling you to do the things that you want because they're fun and you will enjoy them. That is the id. And it makes sense that that is the first part that forms when we are babies. Because when we're born, we're not thinking about, I should do this, I should eat my vegetables. These are things that we are taught. Instead, it's, I'm uncomfortable, so I want to be changed. I'm hungry, so I want to be fed. That the beginning of our life is really based on this idea of seeking out things that will make us comfortable and happy. And that is the first thing that we as humans learn to do. As time goes on, usually because of our parents, we develop what's known as our superego. And this is the part of our personality that tells us what we should do. So you can think of this as our morality principle. It is our conscience. So if we have the devil on one shoulder, you can think of it as the angel on the other shoulder, the one that tells us what we should do. So if there are times where you feel like, I don't want to do my homework, I just want to watch things on Netflix, that is your id telling you to do what you'll enjoy, what makes you happy. And if there's another part of you that's saying, I should really get to work, I should really get started on my homework, that's your superego, your conscience, that is telling you how you should behave. The ego is the self. And we don't mean ego as in someone who has an inflated belief about themselves. The ego just means the individual themselves who have to balance the needs of the id and the superego. So the ego's job is typically to find a way to compromise, to find a way to strike a balance between what we want and what we should do. And so the id is referred to as the reality principle. It is the executive decision maker part of our personality. So as our ego tries to seek balance between our id and our superego, we are sometimes confronted with aggression, anxiety, frustrations that our id wants us to act upon, but our superego completely prevents us from doing so. And that is this conflict that Freud describes that we are constantly dealing with within our personality. So defense mechanisms were created as a way to explain how we can change the object or direction or the way that our frustration or anxiety looks in the world to become a way that is more socially acceptable to our superego. So there are 8 defense mechanisms that our ego will use to protect itself from the desires of the id. For example, the first one is repression, and that is simply banishing those unwanted thoughts or feelings. This is the defense mechanism that really underlies all other defense mechanisms. The idea is if something is unpleasant or anxiety provoking, that one of our first instincts is to just push it from our conscious mind. Other things that we do include regression, so going back to an earlier childlike state. So when we are frustrated or feeling anxious, we revert back to a time when we weren't the ones in charge. There was someone else taking care of us and looking out for us. And so we might see someone go back to a childlike state where they want a parent to take care of them so that they don't have to be in charge of their own life anymore. Reaction formation is when we make an impulse appear its opposite. You can think of this as seeing someone who causes you frustration or anxiety, and if you can't act on those emotions, instead you smile at them, maybe you compliment them, and you're very nice to their face. It's a way of making an impulse appear its opposite. Projection is taking what you don't like about yourself and looking for it in other people in order to make yourself feel better. So if I am self-conscious about my nose, then I might look at other people's faces and constantly look for flaws that another person may have. It helps me to feel better about my own insecurities. Or if I talk about other people behind their backs a lot, I might be the first person to criticize someone else when they do that. All of this is to satisfy my own id, feeling bad about things that I don't like about myself. Rationalization is justifying our behavior. Again, you can think about this in a way that's going to help us feel better about ourselves. So say someone loses their job and has to downgrade to a smaller car. They tell their friends and family that it's better for the environment or uses less gas. And so they are justifying or rationalizing their behavior in order to hide the true reason. Or someone who doesn't get into the college of their choice and then explains that they wouldn't have wanted to go there anyway because they really wanted a school that had the features of the school that they are now going to go to, hiding their true reason for not going there in order to make themselves look and or feel better. Displacement is taking that frustration and anxiety out on a more acceptable source. So say your parent yells at you and your superego tells you you shouldn't yell back, and instead you go to your room and you yell at your little brother or you punch a pillow. We are taking that frustration and that anxiety out on what in our minds we deem to be a more acceptable source. And then finally, sublimation is taking unacceptable urges and turning them into something socially valued, meaning we take our frustration and we take it out on an athletic field. And if we were to say get in fights in the hallway, that would be considered unacceptable behavior, but being very aggressive in a sporting contest, we are now praised for it. Or perhaps we experience people that we don't get along with at school, and we go home and we create fictional short stories where we take that aggression out and turn those people we don't like into fictional characters and eventually become a best-selling author. Instead of taking our aggression directly out on that person, we turn it into something that's socially valued and something that we can become successful off of. So these are ways that we can use defense mechanisms to either change, distort, or redirect the frustration and anxiety that we feel in order to satisfy our id. The last piece of Freud's personality theory are the psychosexual stages that help us to understand how we become the adults we are today. So Freud believes that our personality is formed in the first several years of our life, that we go through these very significant and important stages that are then going to lead to our behavior as adults. Each stage has a specific focus or a specific zone of development that Freud felt was pivotal in our development as individuals. And if something were to go wrong in that stage, we become fixated, and that is going to impact our behavior as adults. So the first stage of development he called the oral stage, because he felt this stage focused on the mouth, specifically breastfeeding and being weaned at the appropriate age. So Freud believed that if we were weaned too early or too late, we might develop what's known as an oral fixation, where we might develop obsessive thoughts that focus on the mouth. He said that people that were smokers or people who overate had an oral fixation. Even those that became too dependent on other people, maybe because they were weaned from breastfeeding too early, then became very clingy to other people as adults. The second stage, the anal stage, focused on potty training. And again, Freud believed that problems that existed during potty training could affect us in our adult years. Basically, what he focused on was how strict or lenient our parents were if we made mistakes while potty training. If our parents were too strict, that might instill a sense of fear in us of making mistakes. And that fixation shows up as being anal retentive. If you've ever heard of someone being called anal before, it's usually because they're very clean and organized and like doing things a certain way. Freud believes that people develop that personality trait because they become so afraid of making a mistake during the potty training stage. If their parents are too lenient, where they do make a lot of mistakes, but they're not punished for it, that then a person becomes anal expulsive. And this is where a person is very messy and disorganized in their adulthood. The last real formative stage in Freud's psychosexual stages of development is the phallic stage. And this is where Freud believes the big focus is on identification, where a child starts to recognize that they look like one of their parents, and so they start to identify with that parent. Freud believes a lot of our identity is shaped during this phallic stage. Our superego develops, where we decide how we should act, and gender development based on the Oedipus or the Electra complex. Essentially, Freud believes at this stage of development, we start to form sexual feelings for our parent of the opposite sex. So for young boys, they fall in love with their mother. Young girls fall in love with their father. And they hate the parent of the same sex because that parent got to marry the person that they love. And so this is referred to as the Oedipus complex for boys or the Electra complex for girls. Eventually this is resolved in the idea of if you can't beat them, you join them. So for boys, if they can't beat their father to marry their mother, they should start acting like their father. And for girls, if they can't beat their mother to marry their father, then they should start acting like their mother. And so part of our superego is developing these gender stereotypical behaviors as a result of identifying with the same-sex parent. It's easy to see in this example why a lot of Freud's theories are discredited and not used today. After the phallic stage comes the latent stage, where essentially nothing happens. This is the stage of elementary school where sexuality is dormant, and oftentimes our friends are children of the same sex. Then Freud believes that once we hit puberty, we enter into the genital stage, and if those first three stages were successful and healthy, then we become healthy, functioning adults. But if there is a problem at one of those first three stages, then we will see that manifest in the genital stage into adulthood. So this is how Freud described personality, how we think and act, why we are the way that we are. Again, you can see that not all these theories are valid, and there are a lot of criticisms to the way that we describe personality today. In our final video, we'll take a look at the Neo-Freudians, his followers who eventually broke from Freud's original ideas to create some theories of their own. Thanks for watching, and always remember, be kind to your mind.